Chris Sharrock, Vice President of UN Affairs and International Organizations at Microsoft. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you. It's great to be here in Paris.
Yes, and a true partner on global stage, so thank you for that. I want to start by asking you a bit about the office itself. So why does Microsoft have a UN Affairs office, and what is your role in helping to connect the tech company to a multilateral organization?
No, look, it's a great question. Of course, we have an office in New York, which is what a lot of people see. We show up at the UN meetings in New York like UNGA. And what we're trying to do is, I guess, engage with the conversation that's happening. And we think we've got a role there because we're a global company. There's global challenges being talked about. And part of the solution to those challenges has to be technology. So as a global technology company, we approach with some humility. We're not going to solve everything, but we think we can be part of the conversation at least.
I think what's interesting about your background is that you've worked in government. You're in the UK government working in the Treasury Department.
That's right.
Yeah, and at OECD as well. So you've sort of seen the world from both sides. And how has that informed what you understand the needs of public sector are when it comes to technology and data?
Well, look, I started as a high school teacher, in fact, and so I've delivered public services, and I remember using technology, which in those days was an overhead projector. So I think, the way that technology, it kind of comes into the public sector is something I've always thought about. I went into the Treasury. We pretty quickly had conversations in the early 2000s about the internet. I worked as chief economist in the Department of Culture, which was responsible for tech policy. I had to think about the productivity gains of the internet and broadband. And, I think what you understand when you work in the public sector is if you really want to understand what's happening, particularly in technology, you need to talk to the private sector. So that need to consult, that need for dialogue, they need to think about practical approaches to improving society. That's always been at the forefront of my mind. And then, because we're here in Paris, maybe just to say, so I was the ambassador here for the UK at the OECD, and I discovered in my time here that Paris is a really important place for multilateralism. You have got the OECD, this body that was set up, actually coming out of the Marshall Plan that the US brought in after the Second World War. You've got UNESCO with its mission, including on some work on AI recently. And then you've got things like the Paris Peace Forum. And there's something in the DNA of Paris about bringing people together for some of those conversations.
And of course, the Paris Climate Accord, which is approaching its
Right.
10th anniversary, little bit of a rocky moment for climate action right now. But I love the fact that you were a high school teacher, and AI is such an important topic right now in education.
Yeah.
But before we get there, and I might ask you about that as well, AI diffusion is a huge topic as well. And what we're seeing is, even though there's been exponential uptake and adoption of AI, fastest growing general purpose technology in history, really, that adoption is completely uneven. So that yawning gap that we're starting to see between the advanced economies and the global south or global majority, whatever you want to call it, why is that concerning, and what risks does that present?
I mean, look, you hit the nail on the head. AI is a GPT that is going to accelerate progress across so many parts of the economy and society. But the fact is, not every country is starting from the same point. And you see that very, very clearly when you're part of the UN conversations. Different countries face different challenges depending on their stage of development. And then something like the Paris Peace Forum, which has a stated part of its mission to bring the voice of the South into the conversation, you realize that question of equity and access is really at the forefront. Often we're talking about finance in those conversations, but increasingly it's been about AI. And I think in technology, we understand that there are digital divides that exist. You don't have electricity supplied equally across the world. You don't have reliable high-speed broadband equally across the world. There's half the world pretty much that can't access AI in a way that would really make it meaningful. So if that half of the world is starting from a pretty low base and the other half of the world is starting from a high base, and then you accelerate ahead, the risk is that you have a kind of exponential divergence of where people end up in terms of their economy and their society. And that's going to create division, and it's going to cause problems. So, we've got to think about that globally. How do we make sure that as we start this journey, we're trying to get a sense of equity and diffusion of the technology across the world?
So we've heard the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talk about networked multilateralism, which is basically code for multi-stakeholder approach to problem solving. bringing the private sector to the table. In your mind, given your experience, what is the most effective public-private partnership when it comes to something like AI diffusion?
Yeah, well, look, I think I said it earlier that when you're in the public sector thinking about policy, if you don't consult and have dialogue, then you're not going to make effective public policy. I think everyone knows that. So before we even talk about partnership, we have to talk about dialogue. And our society is made up of not only the public sector, the private sector, the non-profit sector. It's reasonable that all of those voices are kind of brought into a discussion when you're thinking about framing a public policy response. And it's equally reasonable to do that at an international level in a multi-stakeholder way. And of course, the international diplomatic system is pretty rigid. It was established at a slightly different time, based on diplomats in a room talking personally. There's different ways we can do things. I think the Paris Peace Forum demonstrates that in the last 8 years, there's been all sorts of multi-stakeholder initiatives that have been developed here that have led to action. And I think what the Secretary General is talking about is bringing some of that energy into the UN. I don't think anyone's asking for the private sector to have a vote, but I think we're asking to have a voice so that we can contribute and try and bring our expertise and our evidence to bear. And the last thing I'd say is that the technology that we have, AI, is incredibly adept at bringing a massive amount of information, synthesizing it, distilling it, and bringing it to bear in a kind of efficient way on a conversation. Imagine what we could do if we used AI to harness these multitude of voices around the world that have got something to say, to marshal that, to feed it into the conversations in the UN, and actually try and do things in a modern way.
So, former high school teacher, biggest risk of introducing AI into the education system and biggest opportunity?
It's a good question. I think the risk is that we don't spend our time focusing on what's happening inside children's minds. Fundamentally, what you're doing as a teacher is helping people learn how to think. And so some of those things that we all remember doing, like memorizing texts or reading through hundreds of pages and then trying to synthesize it, that's building the muscle of the brain. And I think, of course, AI is incredibly productive and efficient in helping us do that, but people probably need to know how to do it themselves in the first instance and then to apply AI to become more productive in doing it. I think the additional risk is that teachers, and this is speaking from experience, I was one of those teachers who couldn't quite figure out how to use the new technology. And I think we do have to spend time training the profession, working with the profession to try and bring the tools into the classroom in a way that's going to work for them and work to support them. But maybe the last thing is that there's a conversation that needs to be had, I think, about the way that the education system and the outcomes of the education system need to evolve, because we are teaching children who are going to enter a different world of work. What skills do they need to have? What competencies do they need to have? How can AI help deliver them? That's a really important conversation, and it needs to be an inclusive one.
Chris Sharrock, thanks so much for coming by.
Thanks, Tony.